In some parts of Boston, emotional distress from acts of violence might be thought of as a chronic condition. If the healing response to the wounds of the bombing has gone viral as Boston Strong, the response to neighborhood violence has changed very little. But one change took place last year, a tally of shootings in the city after the bombing. The count raised a question about the measure of loss, public attention, and community engagement. Our guests have been trying to answer those questions through a pop-up art show in Copley Square, co-sponsored by Community Church of Boston. We'd like to welcome Shea Justice and Jason Pramas. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with each of you about why you took on this kind of a thing, and starting with you, Shea, what got you going?
Just the fact that it was a horrible situation that had happened with the bombing, feeling sympathy for the victims and the people who suffered from it, but also thinking about this happening in so many other neighborhoods, particularly places where I've grown up, and where is that outpouring of passion and, you know, support and love towards people who in parts of Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan had nothing to do with certain acts of violence, but the media tends to dismiss it as, oh, it's in Roxbury, so it's no big deal. These individual people, some of whom have been friends, former students of mine and things like that. So that started me really thinking about how the media and how corporations put certain value on certain communities and certain value on certain lives, and that's what got me started.
Well, I know, starting with the numbers from the Marathon bombing, Shea, I think 3 fatalities directly from the bombing,
yes,
but hundreds of people who were physically injured, and then you get into the emotional ripple effect. But I guess that's certainly enormous, but compare that to the people you knew of, maybe not the physical victims of violence, but the family members, the trauma, stuff that
post-traumatic stress disorder that a lot of medical professionals don't want to find out about in certain areas like Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, because it's going to be costly for treatment. So a lot of times they don't diagnose it.
Jason, what about your pipeline to this?
Well, I mean, I run a Boston News Weekly for the last 6 years called Open Media Boston, and we cover what you might call protest beat. We cover a lot of social justice struggles around the city, especially in communities of color. So right away, there's that connection, and there's the fact that my mom's family is from Dorchester. I spent a lot of time there as a child, although I grew up mostly in Peabody, where my dad's family is. Came back when I was 17. But the other thing was that, you know, I have some racist cousins, you know, out in the suburbs, and so over the many years, you know, I've heard them exclaim upon, you know, violence going on in the city as if people kind of deserved it somehow, you know, that they weren't good people somehow, and that these bad things happen to bad people. And when I began to think about the ongoing violence toll, I mean, first I had the reaction to the tragedy that everybody else had. We all had, all the artists in the show, you know, as natives, had the same reaction that everybody else had to the bombing. It was horrendous. We were like, how can this happen here? I mean, we can think about the larger geopolitics or whatever, but we were just as shocked as everybody else and as saddened. But then I began to think, I mean, even the day of the bombing, there was a shooting, you know, in town, you know, that resulted in a death. And, you know, 3 weeks later, I began to think, well, wait a minute. We have death after death after death, you know, week after week after week, you know, around town, you know, street violence, shootings mostly. And where I saw this tremendous outpouring of sympathy, as there should be, you know, to the victims of the bombing, and also money through the One Fund. And then I was like, well, where's the One Fund for all these other folks? Why is there this disconnect? And that's how this stuff germinated in me. And then we started talking, and then we brought Daryl Ann, you know, Gain McCullough in with us also, who's not here today.
For sure, one place where you do see the difference is in media coverage.
Yes,
yes,
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess in your art, you seem to work with at least some pieces of media coverage as well?
Newspapers, articles that talk about one piece in particular, cutbacks to school services, yeah, returning things to neighborhood schools, but also resources being taken away. Kids that are now 7th to 8th grade in the city they're no longer going to have yellow bus services and things like that. So I want to address things where a lot of the political figures and the people in positions of power and authority are now saying, we don't have enough money for this. There's not enough money for that. There's not enough, so it's making it more and more difficult for a young student of color in a lot of these schools to have the kind of education that a suburban school student would have.
Now, we can be a little more explicit here because we've been hearing that for years. We've been feeling it for years. Yeah, but now that we have the One Fund and all this money, it feels different.
It's favoritism. it's uncomfortable favoritism by corporations and by a lot of those in the media as to whose lives are more important and whose circumstances are more important. And that's what it really comes down to.
Yeah, and I mean, I must say that, I mean, my own work within the show, you know, looks at kind of, among other things, it looks at the role of the corporations that gave a lot of money to the One Fund. I'm looking at the 6 companies that gave $1 million each to the One Fund, and they definitely were doing it for the right reasons. But I was looking at, number one, the fact that if we lived in a country with national health care, like Canada, UK, France, Germany, what have you, there wouldn't need to be a One Fund because people would just have their health taken care of. The same way as if we had national health care, the people in the communities that are constantly dealing with shootings and deaths would also have that health care for both critical and long-term care, which is tremendously expensive. But some of the companies in question, for example, you know, hurt the city, like John Hancock and Liberty Mutual, by lobbying against national health care. It's quite direct. So people don't get the care they need in these situations. And that's just one slice of what some of these major companies do to harm Boston in terms of how they provide bad jobs, often ununionized, how they affect certain debates. Like Bank of America gave $500,000 and they foreclosed on a whole bunch of people in Boston. That creates poverty and immiseration. It's direct. And that part of the equation is never looked at. So we did want to talk about that dimension of it as well. And like ask, what is the role of these private interests in distorting the public debate to prevent the amelioration of poverty, and therefore, which would definitely dampen down the violence. Sociological data has been saying this for decades. It's not a mystery. Yeah.
Shea, what about the slogan? Because the title of this exhibit takes the branding Boston Strong, puts a question mark after it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very hard to say there's something wrong with the branding per se, but what's your take on it?
Why we have it question mark Boston Strong? Because is it really all of us, or is it really some of us? When you say Boston Strong, it's sort of like, in some circumstances, when you look at our patriotism when it came towards after 9/11, there is that patriotism of we're all one proud Americans, but yet I get to knock a Arab person upside the head or a Muslim person upside the head on the street because I assume that they're from another country and stuff. So it's like, okay, we're all proud Americans, but that person's probably been born here too. You can't just assume, oh, they're foreign, so we can jump on them. So it starts becoming, well, when you say all of us together, Boston Strong, how does it relate to those of us who have not, you know, who are often targeted, often ignored, often unappreciated? It's very painful and it's hurtful. And for some people to just see all this prioritization over this thing. Again, this is a very important situation that has happened. I'm not in any way degrading it at all. But there are others who are suffering and going through other experiences as well. And acts of violence, acts of assaults, killings, murders, or what have you. Families and children and stuff who've been impacted. Do their voices count? Do their lives have any meaning? And so in that sense, that's why Boston Strong with a question mark.
Jason, what about your thoughts on this, the branding?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I agree with Shea, and I would add that, you know, the question is, how is Boston strong when we have children, you know, going hungry, when we have schools being, you know, having their budget slashed and being closed, when we have, you know, like I think you mentioned earlier, the yellow bus service being cut for many students, when we have people being foreclosed on, you know, all these economic issues and also environmental issues, social and cultural issues. All this stuff is going on around, you know, the majority of the city. That doesn't speak to a strong city. You know, that's a blind spot, a big one, and we want to address it with dialogue. You know, we think that the way to improve the situation has to begin with a conversation, not just with people in Boston, but also with all the folks in the suburbs, the largely white suburbs that have, you know, rightfully poured out their hearts for, you know, the victims and for the One Fund. Let's have that sympathy to the whole city. And, you know, let's be a strong region. But otherwise, if people are claiming Boston as theirs and they live outside the city and they're only looking at this one kind of victim, that's problematic. Yeah.
Shea, talk about the artworks that you have in this exhibit. You're the full-time artist here, so you.
I'm the full. Don't make me scared. Okay.
We all are.
Yeah. We all are. I'm a school teacher too. Right. I'm not just. I have some works that are collage construction that I put together of what looks like monuments that you'll see when you come by the show. I've worked in watercolor. I use a lot of text in some of the things I've done. I've done some pen and ink, some pencil watercolor drawings, and one pencil drawing of some of the things that I remember from what had happened on April 15th of last year. So
what do you remember from that day?
Not wanting to leave the house when CNN's John King made the announcement that the suspects were 2 dark-skinned males. I was like, I'm not leaving the house till this is settled, because I don't know what's going to happen and what accusations. I remember being shocked and disgusted, especially seeing some of the footage of people wounded and injured. I remember the David Ortiz making a comment at the rally. I remember those images of the suspects with the baseball caps and things like that. I remember the boat. I mean, just as much as anyone else would remember, those are the things. I remember how ironic, how strange, how connected I was to it, in a sense that it happened near the first bombing happened not that far from the Charles Mark Hotel, and one of my closest friends works there, Jefferson Ryder. So I was like, oh my God, I hope he's okay. The bombing happened on the 15th, which is my sister Natasha's birthday, and they caught the guy on the 19th, which is my brother Saeed's birthday. So it was all these weird connections. And a woman I dated when I was in high school, her sister was one of the victims. So it's hard not to see some sort of connection in some way, shape, or form.
Jason, what about you? What do you remember?
Well, I mean, running a city news operation as I do, we didn't have any particular reason to cover it, because normally we'd cover people that try to do some kind of political protest around the marathon. And there have been many years when I've been down there, like taking photos and covering stuff or whatever. I wasn't there. One of my reporters was right near there, and she texted me like, oh, I'm trying to decide with my friends whether I should go over or not. And fortunately, she didn't go over, because then she would have been possibly hurt or killed. And that was the thing that stuck in my mind. And then right away, because, it was the middle of the day and I'm getting all the different feeds that I get for info, I'm starting to hear, loud noise, down at Copley, explosion, and then it just got worse and worse and worse. Yeah. Within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, we knew, that something had gone wrong.
Well, we should wrap up with a mention of the opening of this exhibit, because that's happening very, very soon. Yeah,
there's 2 openings. There's one tomorrow, which is Tuesday, April 15th from 7 to 9 p.m., and that's a community opening. Featuring Mel King and Tina Cherry from the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, and Aunt Thomas, who's a local hip-hop personality. And then on Friday from 6 to 10 p.m., we have a kind of a traditional art opening. Yeah.
Wine and cheese.
Wine and cheese, yes.
All right. And this is very close to the finish line, and the address on Boylston, is it?
565 Boylston Street, and it's on the 2nd floor in what's called Lothrop Auditorium, right off the elevators.
All right. Thank you both very much. Shea Justice and Jason Pramas.
Thanks very much, Chris.